I think we've gotten our first hint of what the bishops' meeting in February that's meant to address the ongoing scandals in the church is actually going to look like. I suspect the Vatican, under the wise and honest tutelage of Cardinal Supich, friend of this channel, will make sure that the blame for the crisis in the church is spread around widely, and that little, if any, of the blame comes anywhere near Rome or the current pontificate. Call it a hunch if you like, but I think there's plenty of evidence to support this assertion, if the various stories over the past several weeks are any indication. There's been a slow drip, drip, drip of quiet news stories from the Vatican over the past several weeks that indicate how this is likely to play out. Of course, with anything that looks or smells like a synod of bishops, there is always the possibility that some curveball will be hurled our way, usually not for the better. One only needs to see the inclusion of the acronym into the working document at the Synod for the Corruption of the Youth for a good example. Here's what I mean. Recently, La Stampa did a report that echoed something Commonweal magazine published, where they raised concerns about the Pennsylvania grand jury report. Let's have a look at that first. USA, Commonweal magazine, raises concerns about Pennsylvania report on abuse. The Catholic newspaper challenges the conclusions of the grand jury. It does not distinguish between diocese, bishops, time periods. While the Charter of Dallas of 2002, quote-unquote, has worked. By Jacopo Scaramuzzi. With a detailed article by its former editor Peter Steinfels, the U.S. magazine Commonweal takes an X-ray of the report published in August by the Grand Jury of Pennsylvania on child abuse in the 7 dioceses of the state, concluding that the document is in part grossly misleading, irresponsible, inaccurate, and unjust, and that the report, as the title of the article states, is not what it seems. The report, Steinfeld recalls, makes two types of accusations. One, dreadfully true, against abusing priests, and the second, the abused, have all been set aside in every part of the state by church leaders who have preferred to protect the abusers and their institution above all, which is grossly misleading, irresponsible, inaccurate, and unjust. It is contradicted by material found in the report itself, if one actually reads it carefully. It is contradicted by the testimonies submitted to the grand jury but ignored, and I believe by evidence that the grand jury never pursued. These conclusions are dramatically at odds with the public perception and reception of the report, since out of the 1,356 pages of the report, many have read only the 12-page introduction and a dozen or so sickening examples. The article analyzes the understandable resistance that has led to this particular interpretation, from the tight time frame available to journalists to the timing of the breaking out of the story, while other revelations of sexual abuse, including the McCarrick affair in the United States, have come to the surface with just indignation for the abuse stories, but it also stresses the need for reconsideration to the report while rejecting a binary approach. That is the idea that questioning the grand jury's conclusion is tantamount to saying the opposite. If it is not true that all victims were brushed aside, then it must be true that no victims were ever brushed aside. If it is not true that the church leaders routinely acted to protect their priests and institutions, then it must be true that no church leader ever did that. That is not my claim. I believe that the grand jury could have reached precise, accurate, informing, and hard-hitting findings about what different church leaders did and did not do, what was regularly done in some places and some decades and not in others. Instead, the report shows a tack more suited to our hyperbolic, bumper sticker, post-truth environment with its pronouncements about immigration, immigrants, rapists, murderers, witch hunts, and deep state conspiracies. Whew, lad, okay. In the article, Steinfels, an opinionist on the New York Times, professor emeritus at Fordham University, and author of the book, A People Adrift, The Crisis of the Roman Catholic Church in America, recalls first of all that the grand juries in the United States are bodies at the service of the prosecutors, who are elected overseas, who operate behind closed doors and without consulting the defense, and whose task, more generally, is not to determine guilt or innocence, but only whether there are sufficient grounds to bring an indictment and trigger a trial. It is ironic that people raising perfectly legitimate questions about the accountability of bishops should overlook the questions about the accountability of investigating grand juries. Commonweal, first of all, criticizes the fact that in the report there is, for example, no calculation of how many ordained men served in those dioceses since 1945, a figure that might either verify or challenge previous estimates of the prevalence of sexual abuse among the clergy. There are no efforts to discern statistical patterns in the ages of abusers, the rates of abuse over time, the actions of law enforcement, or changes in response by church officials. Nor are there comparisons to other institutions. Above all, what is missing from the report is any sense of history. The report treats the more than 7 decades from 1945 until yesterday as a block. Steinfeld's taking some specific cases as an example, particularly as regards what happened in the Diocese of Erie, compares what was stated in general terms in Pennsylvania's report with other sources, documents provided by the dioceses, other independent studies, to affirm with Bishop Edward C. Malesic of Greensburg that the essential response to the grand jury can be summarized in 5 words. This is not today's church. In particular, the article recalls the value of the Dallas Charter, approved in 2002 by the United States Episcopal Conference in response to the first emergence of the pedophile scandal in Boston, and all the measures taken during the last 15 years or more by the American bishops, from the investigation of past abuses to the suspension of abusing priests, from trials to assistance to victims and the scrutiny to which the seminars have been subjected, to the work of prevention with those who work in contact with minors. If distinctions can be made from diocese to diocese or from one bishop's tenure to another's, why not make them? Why should such an extensive, elaborate report tar all leaders of all dioceses over all those 7 decades with the same brush? Why can't a report devoting 800 pages to detailing sex acts devote more than a dozen or so to a fine-grained analysis and precisely tailored findings? The author of the article asks himself who believes the real reason is one of the final 4 being recommendations of the report, namely that of breaking down the suing window in such a way that it would penalize not the actual predators and negligent or culpable church officials, in most cases dead or without assets, but Catholics who had nothing to do with those deeds, for such a legislation would expose dioceses, parishes, and charities to huge losses, even bankruptcies, for misdeeds committed by others many decades ago. And if you want to read the rest of that article, I will have a link on the Return to Tradition blog linked in the description below. That's pretty bad. In fact, that's an absolutely awful take. I have problems with the grand jury report, but they all have to do with Josh Shapiro and his long anti-Catholic track record. He's the same guy who went after the Little Sisters of the Poor under the Obama administration for daring to stand with the Catholic faith against the secular religion of social justice by refusing to comply with the Obamacare mandate for providing contraceptives to their employees via the health insurance they provided. But Commonweal magazine's concerns are of a different kind altogether. At this point, anyone who denies that there is a culture of cover-up and corruption in the hierarchy that has existed for a long time and that it exists to this day is deluding themselves. But I expect no different or better of an approved Catholic media outlet. In the next piece of admittedly anecdotal evidence, we see a report from PJ Media and the Associated Press where Pope Francis sent an 8-page letter to the U.S. bishops just in time for their early January retreat that was supposed to help prepare them for the upcoming meeting in February. Francis hit them with a letter blaming the U.S. bishops for the crisis of credibility in the church today. To be sure, there is an element of truth to that. After all, it isn't incorrect to say that a culture of cover-up does exist in the church in America. That is in fact sort of the central thrust of the likely RICO investigation coming in the next several months. But to make a claim that the U.S. bishops are solely to blame for this is to mask the involvement of the Vatican in continuing to promote men like McCarrick and others for their wrongdoing. Let's have a look at the PJ Media piece. As usual, any article I read here can be found on the Return to Tradition blog, a link to which is found in the video description. From PJ Media, January 4th, 2019. Pope Francis blames U.S. bishops' efforts to deny or conceal abuse allegation for church's crisis of credibility. Pope Francis sent an 8-page letter to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops this week blaming efforts made to deny or conceal allegations of sexual abuse for the crisis of credibility the church is experiencing. The letter came as U.S. bishops were beginning a week-long retreat Wednesday near Chicago to confront the church's sexual abuse scandal. Organizers of the retreat said the prelates would focus on prayer and spiritual reflection and not formulating policy. The confab will reportedly serve as a prelude to the Summit of the World's Bishops being held at the Vatican next month to craft a comprehensive response to the clerical abuse crisis. The retreat began a day after the Associated Press reported that the Vatican blocked U.S. bishops from taking measures to address the scandal at their conference last year, and as another scandal rocked the Vatican, this one involving a 54-year-old Argentine bishop who landed a top administrative job at the Holy See after priests accused him of sexual abuse and other misconduct. We know that given the seriousness of the situation, no responsible or approach seems adequate. Nonetheless, we as pastors must have the ability and above all the wisdom to speak a word born of heartfelt, prayerful, and collective listening to the word of God and to the pain of our people, the pontiff wrote in his letter to the bishops. In recent years, the church in the United States has been shaken by various scandals that have gravely affected its credibility, he continued. The church's credibility has been seriously undercut and diminished by these sins and crimes, but even more by the efforts made to deny or conceal them. This has led to a growing sense of uncertainty, distrust, and vulnerability among the faithful. As we know, the mentality that would cover things up, far from helping to resolve conflicts, enabled them to fester and cause even greater harm to the network of relationships that today we are called to heal and restore. Not surprisingly, the pontiff let one key point out of his letter, as LifeSite News pointed out. The Pope did not mention in his letter that it was his rehabilitation of now ex-Cardinal McCarrick that contributed in no small part to the current American crisis. A key catalyst of that crisis was Archbishop Vigano's testimony that the Pope lifted sanctions against the U.S. Cardinal despite knowing that he was an abuser of priests and seminarians. Like I said earlier, the U.S. bishops absolutely share in the responsibility for where we are. Any bishop who promoted, recruited seminarians who lived the Bay Area lifestyle, who permitted seminaries to earn nicknames like the Pink Palace, permitted those men to enter the priesthood, who covered for them when they abused children and adults, and then denied the direct mathematical correlation to the Bay Area lifestyle and the abuse of children is responsible themselves. Any who covered when some of those priests became rectors and bishops and preyed upon seminarians is responsible. And that much, if that is what the Pope is saying, then it's true. But do not be surprised if the February meeting results in the blame for McCarrick's rise being placed at the feet of one or more of the predecessors of this Pope, despite virtually all of them having been canonized, save for the one who is still strangely alive. As has been confirmed, Benedict placed restrictions on McCarrick, and then Francis had McCarrick take on the task of selling out the Catholic Church in China to the totalitarian regime in Beijing. That was no small task. Any bishop with restrictions placed on them or sanctions wouldn't have been given that task. He lifted those restrictions himself. But what we see here in both pieces is a denial of reality, a denial of the facts, and an attempt to paint a different reality from the one you and I live in. Don't let them get away with it. Be suspicious in a few weeks when that meeting comes. If you like videos like this, like and share this video and subscribe and click the notification bell below. If you're interested in supporting my work, there are various options in the description below, along with links to my Twitter, the Sources blog, and the Return to Tradition Facebook page. Thanks for listening. I'm Anthony Stein. Ave Maria.